All right. Welcome to Skype a Scientist Live. Today we are going to be talking about albatrosses and invasive species and why invasive species are sometimes a problem. So we are super lucky today to have Wieteke you know what, Wieteke, can you say your last name for us?
Sure. It's Holthuijzen.
Holthuijzen, awesome, thank you. Later this week, we are going to be talking about backyard conservation. That is going to be happening on Wednesday at 1 p.m. But otherwise, that's really all the news we have for you today. I'm going to hand it over to Wieteke. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. So yeah, I'm Wieteke Holthuijzen. I'm a graduate student. I'm doing my master's degree at Northern Illinois University. And even though I'm located pretty far inland, I'm really interested in studying invasive species on islands. So before I get into some questions, I'm going to provide a couple of slides with just information about like what invasive species are. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, I believe you should all be able to see this. All right, awesome. So let me get set up here for a second. There are a lot of different definitions as to what invasive species are. But in general, they're defined as organisms which can include everything from bacteria to plants to mammals that are non-native to a given ecosystem and can cause some kind of harm, whether it's environmental, economic, or even human harm. Now, as a note, though, like the invasive species aren't just winners of survival of the fittest. They usually have some kind of human facilitation or help to getting to a new ecosystem where they can impact the existing food web. And in turn, they can really negatively affect native species. So that's a big problem for ecosystems in general, especially island ecosystems. So here are a couple different examples of invasive species. You can see like in the upper left-hand quarter, left-hand side, I have zebra mussels that are photographed. And these are a really big issue because they can clog up pipes and other equipment. We have mosquitoes in the center of the picture, and they can carry certain diseases such as dengue fever or West Nile. Cheatgrass is in the upper right-hand side, and that is a really prolific invasive grass species that's found in the West and can even facilitate wildfires and displace native plants. But yeah, so there's all kinds of different invasive species. Now, what makes a species invasive exactly? Well, they're typically plants, animals, bacteria, whatever the case might be, that grow really fast. They have really quick reproduction. They can disperse really far and wide. They have phenotypic plasticity, which means that they can kind of alter themselves, broadly speaking, to really thrive in a lot of different environments and conditions, or they can tolerate them. They also tend to be generalists, meaning they can eat a lot of different things. They can thrive in many different conditions and habitats. And many times, invasive species are also associated with humans in one way or another. A great example, problematic example, is mice, because they often really like to live in our houses and you know, eat food scraps and whatnot. So that can be a big issue. In particular, though, invasive species are very problematic on islands, and islands are very vulnerable to invasive species. So even though islands only make up a really tiny fraction of the Earth's landmass, they are home to a disproportionate amount of biodiversity and endemic species. So in other words, endemic species are species that don't occur anywhere else. And one such diverse taxa is that of seabirds, which are found almost exclusively on islands. Unfortunately, though, islands are also extinction epicenters, and the great majority of reptile, bird, amphibian, and mammal eradication or extinctions have occurred on islands. But what is driving these extinctions? Well, it's largely invasive species. So we might be thinking like, well, why are island wildlife so particularly vulnerable to invasive species? So again, many of these species that are native to islands are often endemic. They've evolved in isolation in the absence of often larger mammalian predators. Over time, a lot of defense traits like the ability to fly or scatter quickly or camouflage are lost on native island wildlife, making them more vulnerable to predators. And many times, native species on islands also have something that we call island tameness or naivete. So they don't, because they haven't evolved in the presence of some kind of predator, they often don't have fear or other defense mechanisms. So a great example is penguins. They're definitely afraid and they know of marine predators, but they typically haven't evolved in places where there are terrestrial or larger mammals on land. So that's often the reason why penguins are pretty curious about people, because they haven't really seen them before. They haven't really evolved with people in their native habitats. And a particularly vulnerable island wildlife is that of seabirds, which are found almost exclusively on islands. They have delayed sexual maturity, so it takes them a very long time to develop and grow to the point that they can start to reproduce. They nest on small isolated islands. They often only raise 1 to 2 chicks per year, but they have really long lifespans and they're very slow to recover when there's any kind of disturbance. And they typically nest on the ground, so that doesn't help them either. So some of the most problematic invasive species on islands, especially for seabirds, are rats, mice, mongoose, and cats. They are collectively responsible, especially rodents, are collectively responsible for the greatest number of island bird extinctions as well as disrupted ecosystem functions. So most of the work that's been done on invasive rodents typically focuses on rats, but mice actually have some really negative impacts as well, even though they're really kind of tiny and cryptic. And that's what I'm in particular interested in. Like I said, I'm a graduate student at Northern Illinois University, and I specifically study house mice on a very tiny seabird island called Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, which actually has the most albatross in the world on it. But unfortunately, mice have started to attack and even kill and eat albatross, so they are slated for eradication in the future, and I'm trying to help with that process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop. Ooh, let me see. How do I go back out of this? So always stuff I tried to figure out. Let's see. Yeah, close this. Why can I not get this back to full screen? But yeah, I will go ahead and take questions as I try to figure out how to get this back to full screen and stop sharing.
This will stop other, yes, continue. Okay, let's see if that works. Wait.
Okay, whew, there we go.
Hey, there we go, awesome. All right, well, thanks for sharing that with us. We already have some questions coming in. Also, whenever I think about those animals that live on islands that are like very sweet and naive, I always think of the quokka, because those animals are so cute. You should,
they're
if you've
so
never
cute.
seen them before, look up Quokka. They always look like they're smiling, and they're just so cute. I could die. Okay, the first question is from Gavin. I'm in high school in 9th grade biology, and for Unit 1, we just learned about ecosystem things. Oh, this is just a comment, sorry. An invasive species was my favorite. Thank you, Gavin. So the next question also from Gavin is, why do species cause disruption in an ecosystem? And why are there such things as invasive species? Like why, basically the question is, why do invasive species exist?
That's a great question. And for that, I'm going to focus on house mice in particular, because I feel like they're a really great example. So like, let's think about island ecosystems for a moment, especially Midway, which is a really big seabird colony, but it's way in the middle of nowhere. It's thousands of miles away. Actually, it's 1,200 miles away from Hawaii, much further away from mainland. So in those kind of conditions, wildlife is typically pretty limited on islands. There's not a lot of ways for like birds, insects, plants to get to those really tiny isolated islands. So typically there's only like a very small number of species that actually survive and thrive on those kind of islands. And in turn, they become really specialized over time to the specific conditions on those islands. But because of globalization, international trade, and people just being people and being able to get everywhere, these isolated tiny islands aren't that isolated anymore. And so when people start to come over, whether it's for trade or in just living on an island or for military purposes, a lot of different species can tag along in the process. And so that happened on Midway when the military was really building up this tiny island system during World War II, and rats and mice were accidentally introduced. I mean, there was all this infrastructure that was getting imported to Midway. And because mice and rats are very generalist, Midway is a really great place for them to just absolutely go wild. There's a ton of food that's available. Birds is a good example for rats, unfortunately. And because they are so generalist, they can really thrive in lots of different conditions and lots of different habitats. So yeah, invasive species, I mean, they are really, they get, you know, a helping hand from people essentially by getting to places where they normally wouldn't exist, and then they can really thrive there because they may not have natural predators there, they may not have other competitors there, they may have new foods that they didn't have in their native habitat that allow them to really explode in terms of their population. But it's a great question.
Awesome, thank you. So let's see, what do you do to get rid of an invasive species once it's there?
That is a tricky one. Yeah, so it really depends on what kind of an organism we're talking about. With plants, sometimes if they're invasive, you can apply herbicide carefully to kill them and remove them. Sometimes you can remove plants just by hand, by pulling them. Kind of depends on how invasive those plants are. For mammals and other animals, it becomes a lot more difficult. So for rodents in particular, eradications are often done. And so it's a sad thing, but to restore ecosystems where rodents are really wreaking havoc, Brodificum, which is a type of bait, is applied. It's an anticoagulant, and that can kind of take care of the rats and mice. It ends up killing them. But it's a really important tool for us to be able to use on islands. It works pretty well on rodents, and if it's done and applied very carefully, it can have minimal risks and impacts on other native wildlife. So that's how we get rid of them.
Sounds good. Are there effective ways to prevent invasive species from getting there in the first place?
Absolutely. That's probably the most important part of considering invasive species control in the first place, is to avoid letting them get to native ecosystems or island systems. So that's where biosecurity comes into play. And there are many steps that are involved in that. Like if you have some kind of cargo that's being transported to an island, it's very important to thoroughly check to make sure there's no pests, no insects that are riding along, no mice or rats that are aboard, checking the ballast water. And then again, like once like cargo arrives, it should be put in quarantine for a while to make sure that if there's anything in there, it doesn't get out. And then thoroughly, checking in cargo and having lots of biosecurity checkpoints in place. So any kind of preventative action is super, super important to avoid getting invasive species on islands.
Awesome, thank you. Mrs. Heller's class asks, Kennedy C wants to know, what's your day-to-day job like as a scientist?
Great question. So one of the things that I do for mice on Midway is I study their diet, which might sound a little bit boring because you're probably thinking, well, if we know that mice are eating birds on Midway, then why would we look at their diet? Well, the thing is that mice actually eat a lot of different things. They're omnivores and they're generalists. So they could be eating different kinds of plants, different kinds of insects. And if we suddenly remove mice from a given ecosystem from Midway, the things that they're eating might suddenly, start to grow in terms of their population. And that could be really great. Maybe mice are eating native plants and those native plants might start to come back. But those mice might also be eating other invasive plants or pest insects. And we want to know what they're eating before we remove them so we can be prepared for any other things that might happen after the eradication. So to do that, I spent a lot of time looking at mouse poop and mouse hair. And I do lots of fancy genetic work and even some kind of chemistry work to figure that out. So a lot of time in the lab and working with teeny tiny tweezers trying to pull out, poops and stuff. So a lot of repetitive work, but it's exciting.
Awesome. That's super cool. So are invasive species only bad, or can some invasive species be good?
So invasive species, by the way that they're defined, are non-native species that cause harm, whether it's economic harm, whether it's environmental harm, or human harm. So they could be poisonous. Invasive species could affect crops, etc. There's a lot of different ways. So just by definition, they can cause harm. But there's other non-native species that can in some cases be beneficial. But that's the reason why they're called non-native rather than invasive.
Right. Gotcha. Cool. Is there one invasive species that is like the hardest to get rid of, notoriously challenging to get rid of?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, there are many that are very, very difficult. Zebra mussels are one of the first ones that come to mind. They, there's probably trillions of them by now. They're unfortunately, very well known in the Great Lakes region, and they tend to clog up pipes and other equipment, and they reduce food availability for other fish. But they're super tiny, and there's not a really well-known way to control them right now, other than just prevention, stopping them from getting into water systems. But that is very difficult to do. So I would say that's a very tricky one. I know that folks are putting a lot of time and effort into getting rid of them. And yeah, if you want to go into that field, that would be a place to go to solve that problem.
For sure. Yeah, it's an important thing to do. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Matthew says, can you speak a little bit more about albatross in general, their behaviors, their natural habitat range? They're such cool birds.
They are such cool birds. Albatross are absolutely amazing. They're one of my favorite seabirds. They're huge. Some of the smaller albatross, like the ones that you find in Midway, the lace-in albatross and the black-footed albatross, they have a wingspan of about like 6 feet, but they're on the smaller end. There are albatross that are far larger than them. Albatross spend most of their life at sea, flying at sea, foraging at sea, and they spend only a very small percent of their lifespan really on islands. And they only return to lay a nest or to lay an egg and to raise their young. They're really long-lived species, and there's an albatross on Midway. Her name's Wisdom, and she's the world's oldest breeding bird in the wild. She's at least, I think, 69 years old, and she's still like coming back to Midway every year to lay an egg. So it's pretty amazing. We actually don't know how long albatross can live, and there's a good chance that Wisdom could actually be even older than we think she is. So it's pretty amazing. But yeah, they tend to come back to the same spot every single year, like and within a few meters to lay their egg. Both parents raise their chick together. But unfortunately, albatross are really vulnerable to many threats, both in their nesting areas and at sea. They're highly vulnerable to longline fishing, unfortunately. But on islands, because they're ground nesters, and they also tend to be a bit more on the curious side and not super, I would say, like they're not as wary of predators as like you would hope them to be. It makes them very vulnerable to any kind of mammalian predator, whether it's cats, rats, or even mice. So beautiful, awesome creatures, but also quite vulnerable to mammalian predators.
That's tough. Thanks for answering that. Are there ways to remove invasive species without killing them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. And I think a lot of biologists, ecologists, and conservation practitioners, we all struggle a lot with that aspect. It's the worst aspect of this job is to have to think about that. It depends a lot on the invasive species that we're talking about, whether it's like something like a bacteria to something that's big like a mammal. In some case, if there's a very small, limited amount of invasive species that are present, they can be trapped and removed. Mm-hmm. So that's a nicer method to deal with them, but that is very hard to do successfully because you need to make sure you capture every individual. You can't leave any, otherwise they can potentially reproduce or still cause problems. But as of right now, that is a very difficult method to use unless you, again, have a really small population that you can easily control. But otherwise, they often need to be removed through eradications.
Yeah. It's killing one animal, but it's really protecting another type of animal. So
yes, another animal, but also like a whole ecosystem. So sad action, but important to do.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Charlotte wants to know, do scientists work with governments and lawmakers to handle invasive species? And is there anything the government can help with?
Yes, yeah, all of these entities work very closely with one another, and governments often, like whether it's federal, state, even county, many times they will set policies and regulations that let folks know what are particularly invasive and problematic species. So if they're, for example, plants are often pretty heavily regulated by policy and regulation. You might not be able to bring in certain plants to an area where you live or grow them because they can be really invasive. Mm-hmm. So government, especially through branches like Fish and Wildlife Service, among others, Bureau of Land Management, they keep a pretty good eye on what are really invasive plants and also provide, guidelines, best practices to avoid from invasive species getting into an area where they could cause a lot of problems, and B, providing tools for folks to be proactive. But in addition, for like other invasive species projects like eradications, typically that involves a whole bunch of different stakeholders, government, nonprofit groups, because there's a lot of hoops that we need to jump through to make sure that eradications work smoothly and work well. So they're usually very, very big, complex projects.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. So how does your research help other scientists and ecologists?
Good question. So in particular for the research that I do, where I'm looking at the diet of invasive mice on an island, sometimes, well, many times actually, we don't know exactly what all invasive species are eating, and by extension, what they're impacting. We only might see some evidence, but they could be eating a lot of other things, like a below ground or maybe other places where we can't see quite as easily. So by doing the kind of diet study that I do, where I look at the DNA of prey items in mouse poop, I can actually figure out like all the different things that mice are eating beyond what we can see, like, well, killed albatross in carcasses. That's kind of a depressing way to figure out what mice are eating, but they could be eating, plants or seeds or insects, and that's really hard for us to actually see. So the methods that I'm using right now hopefully will help folks on other islands or other places where they're dealing with invasive mice, and that can help them answer the same kind of questions. What are they eating? How concerned should we be about the presence of mice here? Are they truly invasive, or are they non-native and not causing problems? Those are the kind of things that I hope that my research will help to answer.
Super cool. Thanks. How expensive is it to get rid of an invasive species?
It's very expensive. Yeah. I mean, even small eradications on, relatively tiny islands can cost in the millions of dollars because of all the logistics involved, all the people that have to be involved before, during, and after an eradication to make sure that it works smoothly. Bait is very expensive, depending on how it's broadcast. If it's done by hand, you have to have a lot of people helping with that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes bait is applied by helicopters, so that's also quite expensive. Yeah. And probably one of the more time-consuming and expensive parts of these eradication projects is to make sure that whatever bait is being applied isn't being consumed or eaten by other things that you don't want eating the bait, like native wildlife. So many times native species need to be brought into captivity and protected from eating the bait, and they will be released again once the coast is clear, basically. Right. So that can cost a lot of time and money planning it out and actually doing it. So it can easily go into many millions of dollars.
For sure.
So it's cheaper to not let invasive species get there in the first place.
Exactly, exactly. Could you tell us a little bit more about invasive plants?
Yeah, invasive plants. That's a whole nother ball game and very, very, very tricky. Invasive plants are particularly good at dispersing. If you've ever walked through, well, I'm going to use the West as an example because I grew up in Idaho. If you've ever walked through cheatgrass, it is absolutely terrible because you'll see all these little seeds that are stuck in your socks. And plants are really great at doing that, especially invasive ones where they might have really pokey seeds or really furry seeds that can attach to your boots, to your socks, but also to other animals and to their fur. And that's kind of how they can get around and really increase their spread and dispersal. Plants can also another way that they can be particularly invasive is by the way that they reproduce. Some of them might produce seeds and they can fly away in the wind or, whatever. But some plants can reproduce vegetatively, where their roots are going under the ground and they can pop up as a plant elsewhere down the road. So that's a really big problem. It makes them really hard to control because it's kind of like, yeah, if you chop off like one plant, you still have the rest of it somewhere else.
Right.
So they're particularly problematic in that way. Other issues with plants, invasive plants, that is that their seeds can be viable, meaning that like even after a long period of time, they can still come to life and germinate if the conditions are just right. So that makes them, even more difficult to control because maybe you have like a whole field of plants and you either remove them through manual means or by herbicide. They might still have a big seed bank in the ground and that could still come up later. So they're really, really tough to control, but very important nonetheless. So excellent question.
For sure. Thanks. Let's see, how closely do you need to look at an ecosystem to tell what's an invasive species and what's non-native?
Excellent question. I think many people have spent their whole careers trying to figure that out. Because again, sometimes it is clear, sometimes it isn't clear if a species is truly invasive. Because many times you can have non-native species and they're not problematic. So a great example is thinking about your own backyard or your own garden. A lot of the plants that you tend to grow in your garden are not necessarily native to the area where you might live, but they're not causing necessarily any harm. A lot of times you're growing fruits and veggies that you love to eat that maybe other mammals in your backyard also like to eat, unfortunately, but they're not harmful. But trying to quantify or figure out if a species is actually invasive can be a lot trickier. Sometimes it's really, unfortunately, easy. Like on islands, if you see carcasses of birds, something's eating them.
Right.
And it can be pretty easy to figure out like, well, okay, we have rats here and they're going after birds. That's obviously not great.
Right.
Other times, if they're eating maybe plants or seeds or insects, that can be a lot trickier to figure out because that's often on a smaller scale that we may not be able to see quite as easily. So it does take a lot of work sometimes to figure out exactly what are the exact impacts of invasive species in the system.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so in terms of like animals, we tend to think of like zebra mussels as like the poster child for nightmare animal to try to get rid of. Is there a poster child for plants that are equally like a well-renowned nightmare?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, I think, well, I would say kudzu in the South is a very well-known one. Grows very quickly, can grow over structures very quickly. It's hard to control. It outcompetes native plant species. So that's unfortunately a good example of a pretty bad invasive plant. Out on Midway, actually, we have a pretty big issue, and we had a bigger issue with it's a type of sunflower. It's in the aster family. It's called Verbicina and celluloides. And it was accidentally introduced decades back as an ornamental plant, most likely, because it has these really big, beautiful yellow flowers. But over time, it started to spread very rapidly across Midway's islands. And at some point, over 70% of the land cover was Verbicina. And it grows in these really thick, dense stands that are very difficult for albatross to like get into and successfully nest in, but also get out of. So that was a very big problem, and it wasn't until probably about 10 years ago that Fish and Wildlife Service staff figured out like a concoction of herbicide that was safe to apply, that didn't negatively affect wildlife, but was really effective against Verbicina, and they've knocked it back considerably now, and to the point that Verbicina covers like less than 1% of Midway. So there's hope. Right. But Midway is also like a pretty tiny area, so you can kind of control plants to a easier degree. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of plants out there that are super invasive, but kudzu is a good one that comes to mind. There's honeysuckle, which is a big issue throughout the Midwest and the East. Yeah, there's many.
I had no idea honeysuckle was invasive. I picked
Japanese honeysuckle amongst others.
Right. Cool. Good to know. Let's see, Ms. Valdez's class, they're a third grade class. They want to know what type of animals, reptiles, mammals are the ones that invade other habitats? Like, is there something about invasive species that are kind of universally shared between them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. There are good, I guess, traits that many invasive species share that make it so they can be really successful, unfortunately, in lots of different ecosystems. And one of those, like some of those traits include the ability to grow and develop very fast and also be able to reproduce very quickly or in very abundant amounts, or to reproduce in a very varied way. So plants, for example, they often, they reproduce via seeds, but they also can reproduce vegetatively. So with those two ways, they can disperse very quickly. Other examples of traits are that invasive species are typically generalist. So they can eat lots of different kinds of food. They can thrive in many different kinds of habitats, whether they're cold or warm or wet or dry. Oftentimes, like especially on island ecosystems, invasive species can be super problematic because they may not have a predator in that particular system that could control them, or other competitors that could kind of keep them in place. So those are some of the broader traits that many of them share. That, and they might be associated with humans to an extent as well, because we're everywhere. And so if invasive species are somewhat associated with us, like, I don't know, might eat some of our foods or occur in like human places of inhabitants, like apartment buildings, houses, whatever, there's a good chance that they can come along with us. So those are some of the traits shared by invasive species.
Cool, thanks. Do we know, like, ballpark how many species have gone extinct because of invasive species?
Oh, it would be a little bit tricky to give an exact number, but we know that at least since the 1500s, since like documented extinctions, the great majority of extinct wildlife is due to invasive species, in particular on islands. Yeah. So it's very shocking. I mean, islands are, again, they constitute a really tiny portion of landmass, but a lot of the world's biodiversity is focused on these islands, and they're often very vulnerable to invasive species. So for birds, for example, most of the bird extinctions that we know of are birds that were on islands. And like Hawaii is unfortunately like a really sad example of that, because probably half, if not more, of the endemic birds of Hawaii have gone extinct because of invasive species. And that's everything from like rats that have been introduced to feral cats to mosquitoes that carry bacteria that can cause West Nile virus in birds. So it's, invasive species on islands, big problem.
Right. Are there any invasive birds?
There are a couple invasive birds. Common mynas are a common example. That's why they're called common. European starlings in the United States are also introduced. They can be, in some cases, considered really invasive because they can outcompete native bird species for nesting for food. So those are definitely some good examples. But yeah, common mynas are largely introduced on many islands. They can cause a lot of problems. They often peck at eggs from other birds, might eat them. They might outcompete for other food sources. So yeah, there's definitely examples of invasive birds as well.
Yeah, I know. So I do my field work in Hawaii, and they're all over the place.
They're everywhere. Yeah,
they're everywhere. They're cute, I admit.
They are kind of cute.
But yeah, invasive. Oh well. All right. The next question is, what made you interested in science in the first place?
Oh, great question. So I was really lucky in that I grew up in a family where both of my parents were scientists, and they were both biologists. So when I was growing up, I was always out and about with my parents, camping, and they taught me about like how to identify birds, how to identify plants, and it was really just like part of my everyday life. And I grew up in Idaho, so we had lots of open space to go and explore. So it was really like just part of my blood and part of my upbringing. I was really lucky in that way. And I just naturally had a curiosity about how the world worked from the point I started going to school. But I also struggle with science quite a bit at times. Like, definitely chemistry was not my strong point, and I also struggled a lot with things like genetics, even though those are both things I'm doing right now, but they were very difficult for me. And I didn't really like fully get into science until I went to college, and I took time off between my like freshman and sophomore year to do field work. And so then I was outside like collecting data as part of a research project to study birds and how they were affected by logging. And that was when like science came to life for me, because it wasn't just reading things in a book, but I was outside and actually interacting with nature and like doing science. And that was really how I got into it. And I continued doing field work for a while. That's how I got out to Midway. I was a volunteer out there, helped study albatross. But also at the same time when I was on Midway, that was when we started to see those issues with mice. And so things kind of came together, and that became my master's. Because I was really curious. I was like, oh, this is crazy. Like, mice going after birds that are like way, way, way bigger than they are. Like, that is just mind boggling. And so I wanted to learn more about what was going on exactly.
Cool. That's great. Let's see. So, okay, so here's a question. It's a little long, but it's okay. Are there invasive species that don't benefit from their new environment? Or are they always positively affected by the new places that they go?
I mean, invasive species can definitely face some issues in novel environments. Many times invasive species are generalists, but they may not always be. So if there's some other new kind of predator that they have not evolved to, deal with, then that could be problematic. Or if there's other competitors, that can kind of inhibit an invasive species from being like totally invasive. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it definitely depends on the environment that they're coming into. I would say typically like on very tiny, small, isolated islands, there's far more niches that are available for invasive species. So their impacts can be quite like a lot more severe, because there's typically also like just a smaller amount of like wildlife and other plants and organisms on these really tiny islands that could possibly compete with invasive species. But as you start to go to systems that are much larger, much more complex, potentially invasive species may have a harder time becoming established and proliferating. But it really depends on their individual traits of whatever invasive species you're looking at.
Awesome. Okay, so let's see if there's any, okay, one more. Are there any invasive amphibians?
Oh, invasive amphibians, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a good example, well, sad example. In Australia, cane toads, they were often introduced as like biological control agents, but they kind of do their job a little bit too well sometimes. Yeah. And they will eat pretty much everything. Like, they're pretty big toads. Like, if you look them up on Google, like they're huge.
They're large.
They're large, and they're also toxic. So problems for people, but also for other animals, especially like native wildlife in Australia. The cane toads have been a big problem there. So excellent question. Yeah.
And they're in Hawaii too.
Yes,
Hawaii.
Yeah.
They get whacked by so many invasive species.
They do. It's really tough.
I was on this hike to actually see the albatross on like the corner of the island. It's like a little preserve for albatross.
Oh yeah.
Cool. And we went out like right at sunset so we could watch the sunset and then walk back to our cars. And on the way back, it was pitch black out, and like the trail sprang to life. We saw cane toads. I couldn't believe how big they were and how easy they were to catch, to be honest. I don't pick up cane toads because they're toxic.
Yeah.
But I did, because I'm an idiot. And I didn't know they were toxic. I just picked them up because they were so big and chunky and I wanted to. But don't do it. I would never do it again. Oops.
Yeah.
And they also had these millipedes that were like.
Oh, yeah.
They're centipedes. Huge. I mean.
Yeah.
So big. It was wild. So much life popped up at night. Anyway, and geckos that were also invasive. So it was just like basically an invasive species parade. The second one went down. It was wild. All right, so you've covered, we have a couple questions remaining here, but I think we've kind of answered them. What invasive species have made their way to Midway? You've mentioned those sunflowers, you mentioned rats and mice. Is there anybody that we haven't talked about?
Oh, yes, there's a lot. So Midway originally had like, maybe a dozen or so plant species. It was very limited. But because people went out to Midway for lots of different reasons, at first it was for the Pacific Cable Company, and later during Pan Am's era, where Midway was kind of this luxury travel destination point, and then World War II, of course, people brought in all kinds of plants, like as either reminders from home or more importantly to feed themselves.
Yeah.
And so now we have like, gosh, probably close to like 300 plant species that are in Midway because of that whole process. And the other thing that's increased like crazy too is arthropods on Midway. There were likely really not that many insect species that were present on Midway, but again, now there are hundreds of different species of, ants and millipedes, centipedes, flies, etc. So it's a very highly altered system in that sense.
All right, sounds good. So we always ask everybody the same two questions at the end of every session. The first question is, if you had everyone's attention in the whole world and you could tell them one thing about your area of expertise, what would it be?
Oh, everywhere in the world. I would say think really carefully about where you're going and be very careful where you go. Just being considerate about other ecosystems, because even though you might not think, you might get a lot of like plant seeds or other small insects that are riding along with you as you travel. It is it's a very easy path for invasive species. So I would just say to folks who are like, especially traveling a lot, be mindful of where you go and make sure you're not taking other, organisms along with you.
Solid. All right. And the second question is, you still have everybody's attention in the whole world and you can tell them one thing about literally anything. It can be as big picture serious or silly and insignificant as you'd like. What do you tell them?
Oh man. I probably would just like tell them a quick fact that, even though islands are very tiny and make up a small world or percentage of the world's landmass, that they harbor probably the most biodiversity and endemic species. So they're tiny, tiny gemstones of amazing biological awesomeness. So
awesome.
We love islands.
We love islands. They're very important. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Do you have anything that you want to plug? Do you have anywhere we can find you on social media? Anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up today?
Sure. Yeah, you can definitely follow me on Twitter at Explorer Wieteke. I'm also fairly new to Instagram, but I'm getting there. Same username. And yeah, definitely, like, I try to post what I can about my research right now. Unfortunately, things are postponed a little bit because of COVID-19, but we're getting there. But I'd also highly recommend that folks check out the Facebook page for Friends of Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge. They're an awesome nonprofit group that supports conservation work on Midway, and they're great for seeing like what Midway is like, getting a glimpse into life out there. So if you're curious at all, like what a seabird island really looks like, definitely check them out. They're great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. This was super cool. And Erin, thank you for signing with us and spending time with us too. We will be back here on Wednesday to talk about backyard conservation. So we hope to see you all then. Thank you again for everybody who joined us today. Bye.
Bye.